Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, i pod srcem pita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem pita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem kita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode,
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is a heroic introduction now from a couple of, Soviet and Titoite classics. If anybody is of a strongly anti-Titoite persuasion, they've probably left the broadcast already. So you join me this evening to look at a variety of recent developments across the world and catching up with the foul activities of a certain Lord Cameron, he of the Pig's Head fame. And if you don't know what that is, just Google David Cameron, Pig's Head, college initiation ceremony. You will be horrified by the results. So we will be talking tonight about a number of stories which are, of course, interconnected. The common theme, you guessed it, being imperialism, which are, of course, that the Russian advance continues into Chasov Yar, and the meltdown in the West continues. There is the ongoing unsuccessful but bloody war waged by US imperialism's colony in the Middle East, that is the state of Israel. We have Cameron, David Cameron, Lord Cameron, I should say, managing to combine threats to Iran, Russia, and China all within about 24 hours. So he's been busy. Not bad work for a man who oversaw an actual severe number of cuts to the fighting capacity of his own armed forces. Now he's going around acting as if he's Lord Palmerston in 1855. But more on him later. And we also have another glaring example of Western decay, and that is, of course, Janet Yellen going to China and making a series of threats, which we'll catch up on in just a moment or two. So a number of things to get through in the next 90 minutes or so. So be sure to put your questions on the in the comment box on YouTube, or tweet them, or X them, I should say, if you're on Elon's wholly owned Pentagon subsidiary known as X, or put them in the comments box on Rumble, because we managed to get back up on Rumble now, which is good, so that you can see our program on there as well. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. We will now do the customary greetings in the chat. So we have with us so far Eamon in Cork, who says, "Good evening to all communist comrades. No to scab labor, no to 0-hour contracts." And it's a sentiment that everybody on here, I'm sure, would agree with. Eamon is exactly right. Svetlana joins us from Moscow. Good to have you with us. Dr. Ahmed joins us from Egypt. Thomas joins us. Hello to you. Geli Nikolov, who says, "Hello from Brigstow." Hello to you. Greetings to Otis in Tyne Weir and Disco Void in Withenshaw, just up the road from me. And Sid Hatfield, good to have you with us. Luca joins us. Kawabi is joining us from Denmark and says, "Been catching up on previous streams." Peter is joining us from Perfidious Albion. Sid guesses he can take time away from researching his book to watch the program. Well, glad to have you with us and be in your priorities list. Do tell us what the book is about, Sid, if you can possibly divulge. President Jesus joins us from the dictatorship of Gavin Newsom, and Really Right Guy joins us from India. We have Spurious Furious coming to us on his lunch break in British Columbia. And we have DE, who's joined us from the southern sector. Albert Roundtree is with us and says, "Workers of the world unite." Morgan joins us from, I'm assuming, Cork. Correct me if I'm wrong. Munis is with us. Grassy Knoll joins us from Seattle, Washington. That Day Will Come is with us. Dan Lindstrom joins us, as does Clinton Frazier. Lino joins us from the Netherlands, and Davey joins us from the Republic of Gwynedd. Right, okay, so we have 106 of you watching so far. Again, be sure to share the stream if you haven't done so already, and put your questions in the chat or tweet them, and we will pick up on them as we go along. So, first things first, the activities of a certain Lord Cameron of Pig's Head fame, and the war in Ukraine. What has been going on? Now, I wrote an article on the website for the Institute a couple of days ago, talking about the comments that have been made over and over again by Macron, or Micron, as he's now being christened by various Russian telegram channels, and Lord Cameron saying that if Russia threatens Odessa, they'd have to deploy forces. And of course, this was the subject of the recent call between Le Cornu, the pipsqueak, who's the defense minister of France, apparently, and Sergei Shoigu, Russian minister of defense. And as we covered in a previous stream, essentially Le Cornu was saying, babbling on in the Macron style, about how they would have to deploy troops if Russia went too far, etc., etc. And Shoigu predictably said, if you deploy troops, they're targets. And then the Russians divulged the fact that the French had essentially been ringing them up to say, can we send troops into Ukraine and can you please not shoot at them? Not going to work. And so then Macron was joined in his threats by Lord Cameron, a man whose capacity for self-delusion is only matched by the strength of his girdle. And the thing with these various threats is that some people took them seriously, and I didn't really, and I still don't, because quite frankly, I don't take the words of Lord Cameron and Emmanuel Macron particularly seriously, and I certainly don't think these two clowns are capable of making a war on Russia, and I don't think they're stupid enough to believe that they can either. I think Macron is periodically delusional, an egomaniac, a sort of plastic sociopath in many respects. But I don't think that these military commanders believe that they could last 5 minutes against the Russians. And I don't think that I know for a fact that the British military commanders know that they couldn't either. So we'll come to that in just a moment and my reasoning for not taking these threats particularly seriously. But what is happening on the front line is, of course, increasing their urgency. It's now being very widely acknowledged that Ukraine is losing the war, even by people such as the writers in the Daily Telegraph, who previously were all about, saying that Russia is at the point of collapse, Putin is dead, is dying, is mad, has been replaced by an actor, is all CGI, etc. Even they and the Daily Telegraph, which is like the newspaper of choice for the most foaming reactionaries in the British ruling class, well, even they're now admitting that it's all going wrong. And there's long whining complaints from the usual suspects in the Daily Telegraph about, well, Britain's too decadent to fight a war. What are we doing? We need to make sure Ukraine wins, etc., etc. So they know very well that Ukraine cannot win. They know very well the actual casualty rates in Ukraine, which are at least 500,000 killed and wounded, possibly more. We're still not exactly clear. 500,000, I think, ultimately will be the lower end estimates of the losses that Ukraine has sustained thus far. So what is actually going on? Well, the game has been slightly given away by Cameron's trip to Washington, D.C. and Florida, where he went on bended knee to Donald Trump to try and persuade him that the Republicans, i.e. the people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, should stop making their threats against Speaker of the House of Representatives Johnson, that if he allows this bill to go through with the $61 billion earmarked for Ukraine in it, that they will revolt against him and try and remove him in the way that they removed Kevin McCarthy. And so Cameron, in a classic display of foolishness, went off to thinking that he could essentially go and tell Trump to reverse his position and to essentially pressure Greene and Gaetz into reversing theirs, or at least dropping their opposition or not pulling the trigger on Johnson. Now, this shows that David Cameron has, in my view, no real understanding of what is going on in the United States. I don't claim to have a detailed understanding of the relationship between Donald Trump and the likes of Greene and Gaetz, but I think that what has happened is that what is started off as a movement that was based around Trump. We'll call it the MAGA movement, for want of a better term, a movement based on, in voting terms, on disenchanted petty bourgeoisie who tend to vote overwhelmingly for the Republican Party, though some will have voted Democrat in the past. But this is I think that the MAGA movement is based on people who either voted Republican long term or who didn't vote previously. And some of them are personally loyal to Trump. That is correct. There's also a significant working class voting element as well for Trump and candidates who are aligned with what I would call an agenda of American petty bourgeois nationalism, based on, to a certain degree of protectionism a certain degree of should we say, withdrawal from certain aspects of the imperial setup that the US is in at the center of. But the point about people like Green and Gates, I think, is that they're not just following orders from Trump. I mean, Trump has, well, he went back and forth on McCarthy for a start. Green and Gates and others, I think people like Chip Roy fall into this category as well, were pursuing a very aggressive campaign against McCarthy, one that Trump, I think, was only tangentially involved with. I think they will very much have their own agenda. They very much have their own political existence now, and their own base that is actually beyond Trump. And so even if Trump wanted to accede to Cameron's demands or begging, I don't think he would have been able to. I don't think that he would have been able to just give an order to his the caucus that is loosely consolidated around support for him, but again has its own existence and has its own. They have their own base now. These people, and also Trump is a candidate in an election this year where he's been opposing, to a certain degree, Biden's war policy in Ukraine, and has been denouncing the idea of giving unlimited amounts of money, supposedly to Ukraine, but it's not really. It's to keep the war going. So why would Trump take the risk in an election year of giving Biden a win? Why? Why on earth would he do that? Especially for Cameron, who has been very disparaging about Trump in the past, and he's linked, and in fact was in office at the time when the Steele dossier was put together, and was partially linked to it. So why on earth would Trump do any favors for Cameron? He wouldn't. He wouldn't be. I doubt he would have been able to, even if he wanted to go along with what Cameron was requesting of him, because Green and Gates and the others are now largely following an agenda that is set by themselves and also by the electoral base that they have, which is again partially been derived out of the popularity of Trump, but they've got their own profile now. So David Cameron, I think, completely misunderstood the dynamics in play in with regard to the relationship between Trump and this group in the House of Representatives. And he completely misunderstood the power or lack of it that Trump had and his willingness to listen to Cameron. But how does this go back to Cameron's threats over troops to Ukraine? Cameron gave the game away in his press conference that he did with Antony Blinken, the sort of withered figure that is apparently still the Secretary of State. When Cameron repeated a talking point that was that had been spewed out first by that renowned thinker and strategic genius Lindsey Graham, who said, "We're spending the money we're spending on Ukraine. Well, it's killing Russians. It's the best money we've ever spent." Cameron repeated that, saying, "Oh, we've destroyed 50% of Russia's pre-war military capacity." I don't think that's true for a second, by the way. And even if it is true, Russia's now producing hundreds of thousands of shells every month, thousands and thousands of military vehicles, and over 1,000 tanks a year, according to Russian figures. So anything that's been destroyed has been replaced. The Russian casualties, even according to the Media Zona project, which is run by Khodorkovsky money and sponsored also by the BBC, even they're putting the Russian casualties at around about 50,000. So again, like what, barely a tenth of the Ukrainian casualties, and Russia with a significantly higher population, much greater resources, the ability to sustain a lot of military production based on those resources. So Cameron's talking garbage, but the reason why he's there and the reason why he's doing all of this, and he's desperately trying to push the House of Representatives into releasing this money. Now, is 61 billion going to win the war for Ukraine? The answer, of course, is no, and everybody knows that. But what is the purpose for releasing it? The purpose is just to simply keep Zelensky in particular and the Ukrainians overall in the fight. The idea is that Zelensky's position is looking shaky. The Ukrainians are looking shaky all the way along the front line. The Ukrainian state is now passing even more unpopular laws around mobilization, whilst apparently carefully exempting the deputies who voted for this law from ever having to be mobilized to fight in the war. The resistance to the press gangs in Ukraine grows. The crisis at the front gets worse every day. And again, it's now even being acknowledged in the British bourgeois press. So Cameron has gone over there to get this money to do what? He thinks, and the way that, and also it's clear that the administration in Washington thinks this way, is that if they release this money, at least it gives Zelensky a bit of a boost. It pays off various characters that need to be paid off inside Ukraine. Also, of course, most of it goes directly through Ukraine and then back again into the United States, into the pockets of various different defense contractors. So, principally, this is a PR operation. Give Zelensky a win, give him a load of money, hope that this props up the Ukrainian state for another few months, imply heavily to the Americans that if they don't give over this money, that the British and the French will deploy their troops to Odessa or to the border with Belarus or something like that. That they think that by doing this, they'll be able to essentially bounce the US Congress into releasing the money. Why? Because they are basically saying that if the US Congress doesn't release the money, then they will have to deploy their troops, which means the Americans have to deploy theirs. They are drastically mistaken on all of these counts, of course. The British, if they did try to deploy to Ukraine, would get destroyed very quickly, as would the French. And we've discussed this before. And I want to read to you now, I think what is a decent analysis on the actual military realities, and it's a tweet by the American scholar Michael Vlahos, who's a very establishment figure. He's taught at West Point, I think, written several books and military history, and he responded recently on Twitter to an article by this raving maniac and Polish exile, I think, Edward Ludwak, who's like old school, like Cold War, maybe a follower of Zbigniew Brzezinski, and I'm not sure. But Ludwak was arguing recently in his article that the time was coming when NATO troops needed to be deployed directly. Now, Vlahos responded, and I think made some salient points there that are worth reading in full. And so he replied to Ludwak. Vlahos said as follows: "The sticky fly in the ointment is this. Such a war," meaning a war between NATO and Russia, "would quickly and inevitably escalate within the expanding conventional framework of such a war itself. The consequences would be these. First, this would no longer be a war in Ukraine, but rather a war that would be fought across Europe. The network of NATO bases would all be hit by hypersonics and other effective penetrators. NATO troop concentrations inside and outside of Ukraine would be hit as well. Thousands of NATO troops would die. Moreover, the war would quickly expand to the littoral seas and then the oceans. The approaches to EU ports would be mined and many Western ships would be sunk. Military installations in European cities would be hit, as in Ukraine, setting off uncontainable madness of crowds. Second, NATO forces would face not only defeat on the ground in Ukraine, but a storied debacle as well. Escalation here inevitably leads to a greater and more historically degrading defeat than simply letting Ukraine make peace on Russian terms. Third, NATO conscription would lead to revolutions that would topple governments across Europe, followed by the fall of both NATO and the EU. Try on late autumn 1918 across the compass of Europe. In the ensuing panic and absolute hysteria, US leaders might very well spasm into nuclear use. In other words, the threat of nuclear initiation most likely now lies in the West, just as it is in another fraught region whose war cry we stoke, and here it lies not in Iran, but in Israel. Now, the point here is, and when Vlahos is talking about the military realities, he is absolutely correct in what he's saying, in that not only would they would lose incredibly badly. For a start, even if let's just assume for a second that the British that the British ruling class have not just degenerated, but which they clearly have, but have gone to the point where they have decided to just take a punt on a war with Russia to solve their own domestic crises. Well, would it solve their domestic crises? And this is worth just pausing on for a second. So it is often said, for reasons that are decent enough, that a ruling class, when facing trouble, would seek to create a war in order to get themselves out of it. Certainly, there's historical examples of that over the years, or arguable historical examples of that. There's an argument made by some historians that the reason why Hitler and the Nazi commanders started World War II in 1939 is because the German economy, which had been given a boost by military spending, public works, and vast acts of privatization for the 6 years between 33 and 39, it actually started the war in 39 because all that juicing of the economy was coming to a close. They had no choice. They'd built up the army to a sufficient point where it could fight a war against Poland and then against France. And they needed to get on and do this now. Otherwise, the entire regime was going to fall to pieces. They needed to embark on their war of conquest. There's various arguments back and forth on that, but it's certainly true that some historians do analyze it that way. Or that the war in 1914 was partially motivated on behalf of the British by the drastic crises that had gripped the country for the previous couple of years, almost 3 years before the war, from the domestic working classes point of view, and also the crisis in Ireland prior to 1914. And that this was part of the motivation for the British ruling class wading in to what they thought would be a fairly simple task of knocking the Germans down a peg or two, causing a crisis, and being able to, set back the rise of the German economic muscle, which was, of course, worrying them in terms of the competition between German and British imperialism for colonial acquisitions. So, what arguments are being made here and now is that, of course, Britain and France have invested an awful lot in this caper in Ukraine, which is going incredibly badly wrong. They are facing multiple crises on the domestic front, not from mass action of the working class as yet, though that has been more of a factor in France than in Britain, but because of an institutional rot in their political system, a deep crisis of legitimacy, and of course, economic stagnation going back to at least 2008, I would argue a lot earlier. And that this might be motivating them to roll the dice and go for broke. Now, I first of all would preface what I'm about to say here by saying that, of course, it is possible that this happens. It is always possible. But I would argue that this is unlikely for the following reasons. First of all, the British ruling class can't resolve their difficulties by engaging in this war with Russia. It's not a reasonable expectation. There was a reasonable expectation in the summer of 1914. It turned out to be wrong, by the way, that they could, by usage of naval power, blockade Germany and via the pressure on its trade flows, via what they hope will be a quick defeat on the battlefield, that they could, of course, stop the German assault and force some kind of advantageous peace in the war. All drastically wrong calculations, as it turned out. But Britain in 1914, for all the fact that it was decaying and had problems, was still, if not the preeminent industrial power in the world, I think that title had passed to either Germany or the United States, was still powerful enough to sustain a war. It still had the most powerful surface fleet in the world. And arguably the most, either they or the Germans had the most advanced technology in terms of the breaking through when it came to submarine warfare. So they had a reasonable expectation that they could stand up to a war with Germany and not just suffer total utter collapse. Same is true for the Hitlerites in 1939. They had a good expectation that they could knock down Poland pretty quickly, and indeed that was the case, and that they could claim that they gambled and were successful in this gamble, that they could knock down the French pretty quickly due to internal splits within the French ruling class, the pro-fascist section signaling that pretty clearly that they didn't actually want to fight a war. And they were almost successful in their gamble, the Hitlerites, that is. that there was that there would be a peace move in from the British ruling class. Given that prior to 1939, the British ruling class had been doing everything they possibly could to shove the Nazis into what would become Operation Barbarossa. So they had a reasonable expectation of success. They had a phenomenally powerful still industrial base in Germany, and they could expect, or even though this turned out to be erroneous, that they could deliver knockout blows in the West and the East. In the West, they were right. In the East, they couldn't have been more wrong. Is there a reasonable expectation of success in this gambit waged by Cameron? Now, no. If indeed the gambit is sincere, and Macron, the answer is no in both cases. Why? Because they tried their outsourced war with Russia. Not only did it not work, it failed catastrophically. The economic war has thus far failed. The sanctions policy actually pushed Russia, the Russian government, to actually take much more proactive measures to not only defend their economic setup, but take more of a coherent state-based approach to growth, take much more of a hands-on planning role than they previously had. The growth of the economic activity and the economic planning role of the Russian state has steadily increased over Putin's time in office, very, very slowly, quicker over the last 10 years, as we've covered many times before. So we go back to the question: is there a reasonable expectation of success? The answer is no, and the answer comes to us via the failure of the economic war in Russia, the fact that they cannot drive a wedge between Russia and China anymore. They can't do it. The Chinese told Biden to go fuck himself, basically, when he rang up and did his usual, "You should abandon that Putin. You don't know what's good for you." And the question then becomes: can the British, and the French, if they deployed these forces into Ukraine and the Russians attack them, what would happen? I think it's as Vlahos says, any force that they deployed there not only would be destroyed, but it couldn't be replaced. And it couldn't be replaced because of various different reasons. Partly is that there's already a massive recruitment crisis in the British Army and Navy and Air Force now, to the point where they're talking about dropping the pre-recruitment swimming test for the Navy. So apparently, prior to joining the British Royal Navy until now, you had to be able to swim for 30 minutes non-stop. I think that was the test. Now they're dropping that. Now, would it be the case that in the event of a British expeditionary force being deployed into Ukraine, that the Russians destroying it, that there would be a wave of government propaganda and an attempt to drum up patriotism and the institution of a draft? Well, possibly. It's possible. Those residual feelings of chauvinism still exist in Britain. I can testify to that. The government still has some fairly powerful propaganda channels at its disposal. And it would be the prerogative, the priority of the government to whip up as much of a bunch of chauvinism as they possibly could. Here's the problem for them, though. Even if they succeeded in that, even if they succeeded in managing to motivate hundreds of thousands of predominantly young men to sign up for some great crusade against the Russians, how are they going to arm them? How are they going to equip them if this happens in the next few months? They can't do it. There is one existing tank production facility in Britain. I believe it's in, some of it is in Wales, some of it, I believe, is in Shropshire. That was supposed to be producing the Challenger free tank, which we haven't seen anything of as yet. The British Army's already been stripped of most of its self-propelled guns, a few of its tanks. The tanks that are still in the fleet have to be serviced via cannibalizing the remaining tanks. So there's about 30 operational tanks, Challenger 2 tanks in Britain, one factory that could conceivably replace some of them. What about the supply chain for weapons in the British Army? It's stretched all over the world. The last steel plant in Britain that produces steel from scratch is about to close, and the government won't even take the step of nationalizing it. Defense spending in Britain has been falling continuously over the last 15 years, including right now. The government refused to raise it in the most recent budget. The Labour Party, which is, of course, just as much of a rabid servant of British imperialism as the Tories are, again, makes vague promises but refuses to commit anything. What about the ability to get people over there? What about the ability to replace transport planes that will be shot down by the Russians if they try and deploy people there? Well, they have the facility to make new aircraft in this country, some of them at least, but they don't have the enormous industrial capacity that will be required to rapidly replace such aircraft. Now, you might say, well, and under the time of war, they would use all the powers of the state to rapidly build new factories and rapidly expand arms production. Okay, well, how are they going to do that? In 1939, they had the industrial base and the skills, knowledge, and experience in the workforce to actually expand production quickly. And even then, as we've covered before, they had to take direct state control over the private industries and the supply chains because the private owners wouldn't produce enough. So what if this happens now? What happens to the British, the very small British defense production complex, even if they took it under complete state control? Is there enough skills, knowledge, and experience in the workforce, the pre-existing workforce, that would allow them to rapidly upscale production to wartime levels? So, according to the knowledge that I have, so thus far, they can't do that. They can't produce the knowledge and experience that's been lost over the last 30 years since they started cutting down the defense sector in this country, and they know that. They can't produce the tanks quickly enough. They don't have the supply chain in place to actually go out and do this. This is not a starter. Even when they try, and even the government's own strategy when it comes to shipbuilding, another crucial part of this, supply ships and the Navy ships to protect them. They can't even produce a decent aircraft carrier in Britain anymore. The great pride of the Royal Navy, the great Navy that bestrode the world like a colossus, can't even produce a decent functioning aircraft carrier now. Again, like when they tried in Scotland to take over commercial shipping production, they couldn't do that. Why? Partly because the civil servants that were trying to run it were completely fucking incompetent, but also, again, the technical knowledge doesn't exist anymore. It would take months or even years to produce like the management system you would need to train the technicians who are up to speed with the latest production methods, to find and source a whole supply chain that doesn't involve China. How are they going to do any of this? It's not going to work. So you put your what, 20,000 men in Ukraine, they get wiped out, all their equipment gets wiped out. What then? Do you then call upon the Americans to aid you? Well, first of all, I don't think that the mood is there inside the United States to aid the British and the French if they get caught with their pants down in Ukraine. Secondly, can the Americans come to the aid of the Europeans in a wartime situation? Well, there was a report recently that came out which showed that the necessary supply ships that would be needed to resupply an American army in Europe aren't there. They don't have the necessary capacity in the US Navy, apparently, that would actually enable them to carry out the vast resupply operation that they would need to keep an army in the field against the Russians. So, again, they don't have that. They also don't have the capacity as of now in the United States to rapidly rebuild their supply ships, to build new supply ships, to actually add to the American Navy that would be in such a way as to aid a vast deployment inside Ukraine. So the American armed forces and the British and the French can only go around the can only go around the world and ship their forces around under perfect conditions when no one's shooting at them. Suddenly, they have one of the most advanced militaries in the world with the most advanced air defense system and a very well developed air force shooting at them constantly. How are they going to possibly supply the forces in the field in Ukraine? How are they going to respond, or will they be able to respond when, as Vlahos says in that tweet I've just gone through, that all the troop concentrations and a lot of the what's left of the military-industrial complexes in Europe are all bombarded by Russian missiles within the first few weeks? What little that we have in this country will be blown up fairly quickly. And again, they don't have the trained men or the supply chains or the necessary knowledge and experience in the government to actually carry out this vast upscaling of war production that would be necessary, even just to sustain a war for a few weeks after all the initial British deployment had got blown up. They can't do it. This is why, and the French can't do it either, by the way. Macron's babbling on about the great development of French war production. It's all a bluff. French manufacturing is in a slightly better condition than Britain, but not by much. And the French army is slightly larger than the British army, but again, not by much. And they're developing similar problems with recruitment and retention of men there. Like the British army right now, no one wants to sign up for it. Again, you could say you could solve this if people see on TV thousands of Brits getting blown up. But again, if you can't, you can recruit a lot of men. What are you going to do? Send them across Europe in a human wave, armed with what? Lee Enfield rifles? Exhibits from the National Tank Museum? What are you going to give them? How are you going to equip them? How are you going to move them? These things haven't entered into anybody's consideration. Why? Because this threat isn't serious. It's not serious. This is the reason why they're now desperately casting around to try and get the Russians to do them a favor and freeze the conflict for 5 years. This is what Burrell, I think, was talking about, and it's been mentioned in the British press. Well, if we can get a pause for 5 years, we can rebuild the defense sector in this country. Well, maybe, but how are they going to address the fact that the reasons why the defense sector has declined and withered away is the fact that the private owners and BAE Systems, which is it's a near state monopoly. It's a private company, but the state gives it most of its orders. No, Britain is a big arms seller around the world. Like BAE Systems is very interlinked with the British state, even though it's nominally private. Okay, well, if they're going to try and expand production. How are they going to address the fact that it's very unprofitable to employ workers in that way in Britain? The reason why the defense sector is so small. What are they going to do? Now, you could say, well, they'll usher in fascism. Now, some in the British ruling class are already tempted by that. You can find their posts on Twitter about it if you want. But it's saying it and doing it, again, are two different things. Oswald Mosley could make a lot of threats about, restoring the greatness of the British Empire in 1934-35, marching his gang around until they were driven off the streets. Because, of course, he had a reasonable expectation that if he took over, he'd have like the still enormous industrial base of the British Empire to command. British fascism, if it took over now, would need to rebuild it and vastly expand the industrial proletariat, leading to all kinds of problems. And again, like Vlahos is right, if they suddenly tried to start doing conscription en masse under this political regime, you couldn't do it. They know they couldn't do it. Their regime is too weak. The political institutions do not command the level of loyalty that they did even back in 1914. And the leadership is discredited and despised. To actually get to the point where they could have a realistic chance of taking on the Russians, they not only need 5 years, they would need to stage their fascist coup next week, probably, then spend some time demolishing the ability to resist of the working class, carrying through the fascist fake revolution, which we've talked about here before, establishing a new political regime, stabilizing it. Then once you've reduced the working class to the status of near slaves, then you could possibly start on rebuilding the defense sector and other industrial sectors as well. But again, even a fascist regime, even a military police dictatorship in Britain or France would face the same problems, which is, okay, well, assuming you go for some sort of autarkic reindustrialization, what a fascist regime in Britain would be obliged to do is essentially recreate its own gravedigger, which is that they would need to, if they're trying to rely on British resources, trying to rely on British coal and British resources to make steel and British resources to actually feed the country, well, then they would need to vastly expand the industrial and agricultural proletariat, even if you automated as much of it as possible. Like, you would end a fascist regime running some sort of militarist economy would end up recreating an industrial proletariat which would become its own bitterest enemy. So the point I'm making here is that they are stuck. They can't get out of this mess in Ukraine. Even if they wanted to deploy troops to Ukraine in a serious way, and this is why Le Cornu was phoning up, begging Shoigu to not fire at the French troops if they were deployed there. It's hardly a sign of strength, is it? Further point, the British and the Americans didn't even dare deploying ground troops, as far as we know, other than perhaps some of their usual death squads, in Yemen. They couldn't deploy ground troops in Yemen. They couldn't defeat Ansar Allah in terms of the Yemeni ability to intercept or fire missiles upon commercial shipping going to Israel. They couldn't even do that. Again, they can't even create a functioning aircraft carrier without it breaking down every 2 seconds. So this isn't a government that's set up to go to war. This isn't a government that's set up to do anything. It's set up to do one thing and one thing only, which is guarantee the profits of the giant hedge fund that exists in the City of London. That's it. So this is a non-starter. All of this is a dance. It's a very cynical maneuver, of course, from Macron and Cameron. You wouldn't expect anything less. And the cynical maneuver is to try and get this package passed through the House of Representatives, try and get the money released to Ukraine, try and solidify the Zelensky regime, and to hope that they keep the Ukrainians on the ground and fighting. Try and spin out the war as long as they can in the hope that something will turn up. That's been the tactic all the way through. This has been an outsourced war with Ukrainians and some mercenaries doing the fighting and the dying by the hundreds of thousands, precisely because the armies and the states of Western Europe can't do it anymore. They outsourced this to Ukraine for all the reasons I've just gone through here. They have no intention of actually expanding military production. Not really. Not really. They have no intention of doing any of the things that they talk about. British capitalism and French capitalism are far too parasitic, far too corroded, and the ruling class too far gone to actually do anything that ambitious. Now, yes, some in the ruling class, a minority, have some ambition to reinstitute some sort of new bourgeois counter-revolution, some new fascist regime. There's always some who fancy doing that. The bulk of the British ruling class aren't interested at this stage. Now, they may get interested if the level of class struggle in this country goes upwards, but at this stage, fascism isn't. It's not on the agenda of the bulk of the ruling class. They think that they can restore order in this country by bringing in the Labour Party reserve team. That's what they think they can do. We may be facing it in the near future if things degenerate or deteriorate to the point where the class struggle gets whips up. Suddenly the fascist section in the ruling class will become very large and very aggressive and be demanding that order be restored. The real danger for us, and I'll conclude my remarks on this issue on this point, isn't that the ruling class is going to send us to war, send us all marching off to war in, trying to take Sevastopol again or something. A real danger for us is that the condition here, economically speaking, for the working class continues to get worse. And then the working class, the level of struggle will, of course, increase. And the danger then is that the fascist turn will come domestically in Britain and in France, and that we, the communists here, will be in a position where we are not ready to properly play our part in resisting this ruling class maneuver. The danger is not really them marching to war with the Russians. The danger is them turning the class war ultra-violent here and trying to institute either a Bonapartist or a fascist regime in a desperate move to essentially secure their own position. And maybe that'll also be, I think also, there's no maybe, scratch the maybe, that the other part of that would be a more aggressive turn in imperialism overseas, but the principal aim would be crushing the domestic working class. That is what they would want to do first. That's the first problem for us. So that's how I see it. Even if they wanted to do this thing, and even if they thought that by going in, getting a load of British soldiers and French soldiers killed, they could institute rapidly some Bonapartist regime and then have their war with Russia and include the Americans. None of them are capable of doing it. The material forces are against them. It just doesn't. None of this works. They don't stand a reasonable chance of success, and they know that. This is all a cynical game. To just keep the Ukraine war going, keep Ukraine fighting, keep thousands of Ukrainians dying. That's what David Cameron was in Washington and Florida to do this week. That's what Macron is babbling on about in his usual unhinged fashion. But again, they know very well that this doesn't work and can't work. So I'll pause there just to take in some questions and catch up with various different points that have been made. So, Irish Partisan, good evening to you. C. Bolt, who says, late again, no need to apologize. Right. Mr. Chopin joined us from the great Midwest of the United States. Sid Hatfield says there was a huge labor crisis in the US from 1912 to 1917 as well. Good point. Probably why Wilson ended up imprisoning Eugene Debs when he came out and opposed the war. Hello to Putin's shirt, who has joined us. And Albert says lots of Indian sepoys who will join the British Armed Forces. Well, back then in 1914, very true. They had, well, I'm not sure whether they had much of a choice, many of them. Good evening to Ben, who joined us from Hungary, catching up at double speed. Putin's shirt said either Macron is having a midlife crisis, well, that's possible, or France is sweating bullets because it had its eye on Ukraine's rich uranium deposits for nuclear energy, especially after Russian sanctions and losing African colonies. Well, it's certainly a possibility. I think they all had their own motivations for engaging in this project in Ukraine. The principal motivation was that the delusional belief that they would be able to take out Russia, destabilize its government, and collapse the Putin system, and then loot the country as a result. That was the big motivation. Ukraine, I think, was just a means for doing it. Macron might have his eye on the uranium that is present in Ukraine, perhaps, but the bigger target was always the destabilization of Russia. And the other motivation for Macron, of course, is that he has delusionally blamed Russia for their loss of the neo-colonial empire in Western Africa and the Sahel. And that's another part of his motivations. Martin joins us from Vienna. Glad you're enjoying the program. Potted Rodent says they recently started 3D printing in Ukraine for the military. I think they can produce a single-use spanner inside of 3 hours. This should be the deciding factor. Well, I mean, this is going to be another big thing they're going to start talking about, that they can 3D print their way out of this. Well, they can't 3D print, they can't 3D print tanks or artillery shells, so far as we know. This will be another piece of propaganda that they use. Look, we've got a miracle piece of technology. This will work, but it's not going to be the deciding factor. It's not even about weapons or ammo, says Putin's shirt. Ukraine is out of men, trained, experienced men in particular. Will Johnson's joined us. Good evening to you. Robert Richards says US started building B-17s in 1935 once the Social Security FICA taxes came into the Treasury. Same deal with Canadian Avro bombers for the UK. Interesting. Putin's shirt says, does the leadership of Ukro Banderovtsi understand they've been screwed? I think they do. I think that I mean, Zelensky's many things. I don't think he's a complete idiot, though. He knows that's probably the reason why he has to do so much cocaine to sort of bury this knowledge. He knows he's being hung out to dry. The problem for him is, though, the choice now is he either keeps going in the hope that he can extract himself from this, the other side, that he gets to go to his bolt hole, wherever it is. Maybe Israel's not a good bet now. Maybe it's the villa in Florida. And he hopes just to save his own ass. Now, to go in the other direction, i.e., to stand up, he could theoretically go on TV tomorrow and says, you know what, this is lost, it's all over. I will not sacrifice another Ukrainian life in pursuit of a war that has been lost. I appeal to Vladimir Vladimirovich. I appeal to you to start immediate negotiations. We give up the fight without conditions. We agree to start talks without conditions. He could do that, but he'd be dead in a few hours if he did, possibly at the hands of his own bodyguards. And he knows that. There's a reason why, apparently, he's got British ex-SAS men as his bodyguards. Is it to keep him safe? Or is it to let him know that he's only ever one pull of the trigger away from death? So he can't get out, but not without his own arse being on the line, so to speak. So what is the other? What other option do the Ukrainian elite have? None of these are men of courage and men of great patriotism that they claim to be. They're stooges. The only way these people survive is if they please the master. And the master sits in Washington with his lieutenant in London. And the master wants the war to continue. And so the war must continue, because otherwise the puppets here get their strings cut and get tossed in the fire. So these people aren't thinking of Ukraine. They're not thinking of the Ukrainian people. They are thinking of saving themselves. And the only way that they are going to save themselves is they carry on doing the bidding of Washington right up until the last minute. That's the only way that they get out, they think. The only other way, of course, is that they are overthrown somehow, which the Americans are very aware of and will work very hard to ensure that it doesn't happen. This is what a lot of this is about, keeping Zelensky and that regime stable and in place, and sending men by the thousands to die and be buried in unmarked graves or incinerated to the point where they are no longer recognizable as human beings. That's what all of this is about. And if that seems horrible, cynical, brutal, horrific, then you're right. And that's exactly how the imperialist powers behave. And it's also extremely cowardly. Gonzalo Cabrera joins us from Madrid. Dylan Blake is with us. Videos Del Mundo says, good evening. This is my first time catching your program live. I usually watch the programs later on in the day, or maybe a day or two later. I enjoy your Marxist-Leninist analysis. Well, good to have you with us. Dan Lindstrom says, BAE Systems Swedish divisions is Hägglunds and Bofors. Saab. Is that Bofors as in Bofors gun, Dan? I think it is, isn't it? Gillian joins us from Bucharest. Mary says, can you link their inability to fight Russia with the British government's inability to get anything done, like railways, hospitals, schools, etc.? Oh, they can get things done, Mary. But the point is that British capitalism and the ruling class are so utterly degenerated, and the rate of profit is so low that they won't do anything except try and find ways to extract resources, extract profits. They don't want to build anything. Bear in mind, they didn't even really want to build things like Crossrail in London. That was all paid for by the government. The notorious AstraZeneca vaccine for COVID, all paid for by the government. All major infrastructure projects now have to be paid for by the government. Then a lot of these assets are privatized or done under so-called PFI schemes with massive mortgages attached to them. Like, the British ruling class are utter parasites. They don't create anything of real value anymore. They just move money around, and the government reflects that. So, like, look at things like Thames Water, the water company that covers the southeast of England, 16 odd million customers, captive market, privatized 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, hasn't invested in anything serious in over 30 years, now facing collapse because all they've done is extract profit out of the system. not invested anything. Whole systems coming to pieces. The state will then step in, bail it out, privatize it again, and the whole process will begin all over again. It stems from the fact that the British capitalist class refuse to invest in this country, not unless they have their entire investment covered by the state. And the state, of course, being a state run by and for the ruling class, reflects that ruling class in its utter degeneracy. So they don't want to do anything positive. They don't want to invest in infrastructure. They don't want to invest seriously in industry or improvements in agriculture. They just want to go to the fastest buck possible, which doesn't involve doing anything. And again, Marx predicted all of this going all the way back to Capital Volume 2, that the capitalist class would inevitably degenerate to the point where it no longer wanted to actually engage in the process of production anymore. It's been part of capitalism since its earliest days. And therefore, Britain, as the oldest continually existing capitalist nation, manifests all of that degeneracy even more than the US does. And this is why nothing ever gets built. And this is why the only thing that the government does is essentially transfer wealth to the private sector, a degenerate and parasitic private sector. Gillian says, the amount of military posturing here is very pronounced. We are basically a colony whose land and resources are being taken over to feed this NATO fantasy. Yeah. And I'm sure that many in Romania know that the US would happily throw them into the fire at their convenience. The domestic compradors in all of these countries have revealed themselves to be nothing more than quite simply traitors. They are prepared to, if the US did order them to do it, to march into the jaws of death, have their entire country burnt to the ground, and then try and escape themselves to the United States. All these people would quit and run if things got rough, if the shooting started. There's not a single one of them that would hang around. So since the collapse of the old people's democracies, since the collapse of socialism in Romania, it has been run by people who are just hirelings of US imperialism. Like they would burn the whole nation down if ordered to do so. And Romanians, Bulgarians, Hungarians, less so with Hungary, actually. Orban at least has an independent political base and has ambitions of his own. He's a pro-capitalist reactionary, but he's not just simply a slave of the US. But, you know, the clowns that run the Czech Republic are, the clowns that run Croatia kind of are. Bosnia is nothing but a protectorate of US and German imperialism. Like, people in these countries need to realize, I'm sure many of them do, that the people who run them, the ruling classes within them, can't take the country anywhere positive and never could. The capitalist classes there are just completely and utterly degenerate. They are leading the country down a dead end, and if the country's going to go anywhere, these people all need to be removed. Same goes, of course, for the yapping chihuahuas in the Baltic states. Right. Videos del Mundo says, I really enjoyed the programs you did a month ago about the myth of Russian imperialism. It helped me tremendously in my Marxist political education. Well, glad that you got something out of those. DE says, they do seem to be getting the actor Tommy Robinson and his frothing fan club agitated and excited. Well, it doesn't take much. Bear in mind that those people are essentially an adjunct of the British state. I know that Robinson gets tossed in jail every now and again, but he's a state actor and needs to be regarded as such. Lucas says, do you think the unproductive military expenses are underestimated in the state budget? If so, how? Are you talking about Britain or the United States? Can you clarify on that question, Luca? Is it true, says Mr. Chopin, that World War II was started partly to deplete the populations of the working class in Europe, especially as there was an increase of a militant working class like in Russia at the time? I would say on that one that's depletion of the population is an effect of an imperialist war. It's not the overriding factor. And also, I would say that prior to 1939, there was a crisis in British imperialism, of course, but wasn't actually at the level of crisis that it was in 1914 in terms of internal industrial militancy. If anything, in 1939, the British ruling class didn't want a war. They would have much preferred not to do it. It didn't lead, from their point of view, to anything good. French ruling class didn't want one either. They were desperate just to have the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, and they hoped to do the job for them of finishing off communism. Didn't work out that way. So in World War II, I would say what's more true is that the ruling classes did want a war, but they didn't want a war that they would have to fight. As the actions of the British and French ruling class, and especially the British ruling class, proved all the way through to 1944, they still wanted the Germans to destroy the Soviet Union, even when they were formally allied to the Soviet Union. Martin says they can't 3D print a proper gun that isn't exploding or falling apart after firing at one time, let alone tank or artillery. Good point. Putin's shirt says, still, Macron didn't start going crazy till after France lost Africa. Losing the African uranium wasn't part of the Ukraine project, which took a fairly sudden bad turn for France, re Africa. Yeah, well, the French losing of the neo-colonies in the Sahel and West Africa has been a long time coming, but the French didn't expect it. And also they revealed themselves as being completely impotent. When faced with the unified masses of Niger, for instance, and Mali and Burkina Faso, they couldn't do anything. Because what's Macron going to do? Start conscription to go and fight and reconquer French West Africa? No, that's not going to work, because there's an awful lot of people in the French proletariat who are descended, or either directly or indirectly, from either being one or two generations removed from people in North Africa who would not go and get conscripted and fight and die to conquer the land that their forebears came from. So it would create an enormous crisis in France. So I think it redoubled France's support for the war on Russia. Not that they would be capable of actually doing much against Russia, for all the delusions of certain French generals. Lucas says, is there a possibility the Ukrainian regime is overthrown by the Ukrainian people? I'm not going to say that there's no possibility. There always is some possibility, but I would say that the current balance of forces mitigates against that. It is, for a start, as far as I am aware, and I'm not 100% up to speed with the state of play in Ukraine with regard to opposition. The Ukrainian regime destroyed most of the effective opposition when it outlawed the Communist Party. Nothing else really had the sufficient trained cadre or determined people in it who could have put up a real resistance to the puppet regime there. With no leadership and with no organization inside the Ukrainian working class, the best you're going to get is like spontaneous riots, which could take off, but my suspicion is they will be fairly easily controlled. The more likely option is, well, one of two options. Firstly, the Ukrainian regime just moves to collapse under the pressure from the Russian military operation, or eventually that the US imperialists decide that let's just call time on this and do a sort of secret backdoor negotiation with the Russians, find some sort of compromise which enables them to keep some of Ukraine on the map, and basically declares that the conflict is frozen. We didn't make any concessions to the Russians, we absolutely promise, but the war's over. And then bring in some new regime and take Zelensky off, if he survives, to exile in Florida somewhere. I wish I was wrong on this point, but I don't see any sign thus far that there is a sufficient level of organization within Ukraine that could overthrow the Kiev regime. I don't see it. If anybody's got alternative information about that, I'll be happy to hear it. But at the moment, I just don't see that being an immediate possibility. Ben says, lots of great points. Totally agree with the overarching analysis, Alexander. Also, that Ukraine leadership has to know it's screwed. I wonder if there'll be a huge backlash against the West. There will be. I think what'll happen is that it'll be what'll happen is there'll be a huge backlash against the West in the Russian controlled areas. I don't think anything that survives in Ukraine from this, whatever compromise is hashed out by the end, I don't think that whatever state that comes out of that will survive very long. I think if it's a line, people will blame the West. They'll blame the US more and more. It'll whatever survives, even if it survives for a year or two, will be very unstable. So yeah, there will be a deserved backlash as well. But the biggest backlash does not just be reserved for the US imperialists, though they deserve a lot. Should also be reserved for the Ukrainian compradors. Those swines who did this should be forced to flee or face a people's tribunal in Ukraine, because they're the ones who made all of this possible. US imperialism is very much like a vampire in that it can't go where you don't invite it. Geli Nikolov says, people are so brainwashed the anti-communist propaganda for years. That's true, but propaganda can fall away very quickly under the right conditions. And again, not easy, but it can be done. I agree with you on Orban, says Ben. Pavel Stan, Czech Republic, though, that guy has put all his chips on NATO Stan and his Western future. Very dangerous. Yeah, he seems like a real hardcore maniac. But I mean, he's also an idiot, because he went out and said we now got to buy up all the was it the 155 millimeter shells? So yeah, great idea, Pavel, because you couldn't produce them domestically because the Czech ruling class is so degenerate that they deindustrialized the country. So you can't produce them. So you declare that you're going to go and buy them on the open market, and what happens? The open market puts the fucking price through the roof. Nice job, Petter. You know, these guys aren't the smartest. They don't even understand the system they apparently love so much. Lertis says, let's not to forget Gabon. Interesting. I haven't revisited the situation now for a while. I should go back to it. Robert Richard says, Biden can't even front F-16s to his Ukrainian buddies like FDR got crypto Brewster Buffalo fighters to Finland to fight the USSR. Yeah, I mean, the F-16s, they kept talking about them and saying that they're training Ukrainians on them. And not only do I think that the training process for this apparently is very difficult, given that they got to train the Ukrainians in English first. But why did they ever think it was going to make much of a difference? The answer is that, again, it was just a propaganda move. Oh, we got the F-16s coming. What? A plane that's 50 years old in its design? Yes, it's been updated many, many times, but the Russians have been learning about this since the mid-70s. They have more than enough to counter it. So again, it was never about supplying a game changer. It was about getting a few good headlines and keeping the war going. That's all this is about. Mr. Chopin says, sorry, I meant the millions of people who uselessly died in World War I because of European imperial squabbles, not World War II. Well, yeah, I mean, the key cause of World War I is the inter-imperialist rivalry and the crisis of imperialism that exists in 1914. The crisis of German imperialism being that they needed colonial acquisitions and couldn't get them because the British and the French had already divided the world between them, and the German ruling class wanted to get in on that action and couldn't without forcefully redividing the world, breaking up the French and British empires, or by conquering vast territories of what is now, ironically enough, Ukraine. So, yeah, killing millions of proletarians would be, well, if not a side benefit for them, but it would help to resolve some internal contradictions, certainly. But again, let's not say that was the whole plan. It was maybe part of it, but the principal contradiction there is the question of imperialism, which of course is central to the understanding of World War I. And from the point of view of the ruling class, this wasn't something that was minor. They needed those colonial acquisitions because that's the only way that their system could sustain itself. Same today. Galen Nikolov says, I don't see any viable opposition to Kiev Banderist regime. Ukrainian left are anti-Russian. Well, many of them are, yes. So I don't see it being viable for now. Again, happy to be proved wrong on that point. Also, I should mention tonight that we're still awaiting at time of broadcast the Iranian response to the bombing of their consulate in Syria. Haven't seen anything on that so far. Apparently, the Israeli so-called war cabinet is meeting. We will see if anything comes up from that. Anything that happens on that, I'll cover it tomorrow. The other point is that, of course, Lord Cameron, not content with waving his empty revolver, or I should say his empty musket. The Russians also was making threats to Iran, which is completely laughable. I'm surprised the Iranians can stop laughing for more than 5 minutes at the moment. They're also making threats to China, and it is to China now that I'll turn to do the final item for tonight, which is, of course, the utterances of a certain Janet Yellen in her trip to China recently. Got a short video to play on this, so let's pop this into the player and enjoy this one for a moment. Okay, there we go. This video isn't playing too well. Okay, let's see if this works.
China is now simply...
Okay, we got some rough problems there on the video, so I'm going to remove that from the screen. For some reason, that's not working particularly well. Essentially, I was going to show you the threats about Chinese industrial capacity there. Essentially, it's just a brief clip where Yellen says basically the Chinese industrial capacity is too big. Their system is unfair, and it's going to affect American jobs. And their system is unfair. That's that complaint, that whinge has been around by the American imperialists for quite some time. What it relates to partially is the fact that the Americans keep moaning about the Chinese yuan being because the fact that for a very long time it was a currency that was unconvertible, or not unconvertible, than it was very sparingly used in international trade, more commonly used now. But also that the Chinese industrial system being based on an awful lot of course, state-owned enterprises, which are, of course, supported by the Chinese state and are integral to the Chinese production plans and economic plans. Yellen's whinging over there that it's all very unfair and American jobs will be affected by this, as if Janet Yellen gives two fucks about the average American worker. No one's going to fall for that. What are they actually complaining about? Well, they're complaining, they're doing the same whinge they have done for years, in that the gamble on China taken by the American ruling class has, in the long term, it has failed. And what this was meant to do was that, again, the reason why Yellen's complaining is that when it comes to electronic vehicle technology and increasingly other high-tech areas such as robotics, artificial intelligence, and its usage in production, that the Chinese are at least dead level with the United States in these areas, and in some areas they're going ahead. And when it comes to the electronic vehicle production, the Chinese models are apparently, and again, I don't know this for sure, I don't own an electronic car, but what I've read so far is that the Chinese models are more reliable and are produced cheaper than the American versions. Even though I believe that good old Elon does have Tesla plant in China, but the Chinese have a clear advantage in the fact that they can produce a gigantic amount of these cars and produce them far cheaper than they can in the United States. So this is one of the reasons that Yellen is over there whinging. If there's threats to the American car industry in an election year, that's certainly a threat to the Democrats. That's part of the reason. The bigger part, as I said, is that the punt they took on China failed. And what was that particular bet? The bet was that they could continue to use and exploit Chinese labor, and that the Chinese would accommodate themselves to being essentially a supplier to the United States and to a lesser extent Europe, and that this would be a role that they would be happy playing. Now that was a gamble when Clinton made it 25 to almost 30 years ago now. You could see that it made a degree of sense. There were back then very strong comprador tendencies within the PRC and within the CPC itself. And there were those who would have been very happy in the Chinese leadership with essentially taking that deal from the US imperialism of being a perpetual supplier of cheap products to the American and European market, to not really challenge American primacy in in the field of like high technology production, to essentially just act as a workshop for outsourcing to for Western Europe and the United States, and to essentially be integrated into the US imperial system that way. There were a number of people in the hierarchy, especially those who were around like Yang Zemin and the Hu Jintao period. There were a number of people prominent in the party in China back then, who got essentially chased out of town and or imprisoned, executed. There was a move against them and that layer over a decade ago, and this has all gone to shit for them now. It's all falling. This bet has not worked. The Chinese got over the distortions to a degree. There's still problems in the Chinese economy, which we can go into another time, but they're getting over the problems caused by the real estate bubble. They're making adjustments there. They're putting more and more money back in industrial development. And because of the way that's going, Yellen's terrified that essentially what's left of American manufacturing industry is going to lose what markets it has left, which is why they are desperate to tell Olaf the Cuck in Germany and Micron in France and the buffoons in Downing Street, that they got to cut themselves off from China bit by bit by bit. And this is in order that American market share can be protected in various different countries. So they're going to be telling their vassals to essentially cut themselves off from Chinese manufactured goods more and more in order that they can get them from the United States. And this is, of course, something which has been, people have written about this being a scheme that they were running with regard to liquefied natural gas, even though it hasn't really worked, given the amount of Russian liquefied natural gas that has ended up in Europe is still very, very high. And the amount of Russian oil that ends up in Europe and in the United States is still very, very high. It's just rebranded as coming from somewhere else, more than likely India. But this is going to be the play. Yellen is essentially threatening to do, well, some of the things that Trump was denounced for doing, which is slapping more tariffs on Chinese goods, making Chinese goods ever more expensive. Now, of course, the Chinese can retaliate, as they have, by responding to the United States in a similar fashion. For instance, they're now saying that they're not going to buy the gigantic amounts of wheat that they previously bought from American agricultural producers, that they're going to be getting these from Russian agricultural producers instead. So again, they can hurt the United States right back again. So Yellen is going over there making a whole bunch of empty threats. But the fact is that the previous 10 years have seen the Chinese leadership change because of changes in the Communist Party of China, the weakening of the nakedly comprador element, and the coming to power of a group that, even though it remains committed to pro-capitalist changes in certain areas, wasn't prepared to go along and be integrated into the US system as essentially a permanent offshoring facility. So the Chinese have every reason now that they can think they can tell the Americans where to go. And so the response of the US imperialists will be to choke off supply from China, which will affect themselves, which will mean further wars on the US working class. Because if they're going to try and do essentially Trumponomics, the rather strange hybrid that Trump was running on in 2016, has become more and more just the mainstream to a certain to a certain degree in American bourgeois politics. They're now all talking in protectionist terms. They're all talking about cutting China out from US and European markets with regard to certain manufactured goods. And they are trying to carry out some kind of separation maneuver. which, given that part of the reason why they got so many manufactured goods from China in the first place was this was a way of keeping prices down at a time when the wages of the American worker were being systematically suppressed. So if they remove or restrict Chinese imports further into the United States, not only will China respond by hurting the profits of American agricultural producers, it'll also have an extremely negative impact on the incomes of the American working class, as the cheaper Chinese goods that they were buying are no longer available. So whichever way you cut this, whatever Yellen threatens or whatever Trump threatens, in actual fact, is going to produce another crisis inside the United States itself. Because again, US capitalism, is it in any condition to step up and start producing with regard to producing the consumer goods that will be potentially cut off from China? Well, potentially not. And also, the Chinese have been getting themselves, or trying to get themselves, in a situation where they do not need to be, they don't want to be overexposed to American trade anymore. They want to diversify their markets. They want to diversify their exports to other countries. So again, Yellen's going over there and making these threats, and it's just not going to work anymore. The Chinese have moved beyond now being a mere workshop for the West. And it's also going to produce splits in the European Union because they do a lot of good business with the Chinese, and the capitalist class in Germany doesn't want to lose that. Is the German cuck in chief going to turn around and tell the Americans no, though? My guess is probably not. Now, my guess is that, I mean, President Xi is coming to see Macron later this year, and then he's going to see Orban, and he's going to go and see Vučić in Serbia. An interesting trip. He's coming to see Macron to try and talk some sense into him. He's going to basically say to Macron, look, Emmanuel, do you really want to go down this route of essentially damaging what's been a profitable relationship? Why? So you can remain in with the Americans who've already sold you down the fucking river? Maybe Xi Jinping's not going to put it just like that, but he's going to try and make an appeal to Macron to essentially put aside or resist the American pressure to train wreck the European-Chinese relationship. Now, Macron will do what he always does, because Xi and his team are very capable, very intelligent people. Clearly, they know how to play to Macron. They'll turn up, they'll treat him with respect. They'll say, France is a vital nation, Europe is this marvelous thing, we want to maintain our good relations. And Macron will say, yes, 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 yes. And then Xi will leave and go over to Budapest, and Macron will say, we must take action against China. Because this is Macron. And like he bounces back and forth because, again, the French ruling class is divided. And it's not just that Macron's an idiot, even though he is. It's that the French ruling class themselves are divided between those who see the being subservient to the United States as the way forward, those who see the role of the French as being to lead Europe in an independent direction, and those people favor trying to keep relations with both the Chinese and the Americans. Now, the Chinese don't really care if the Europeans keep relations extensively open with the United States. The US imperialists care very much if the Europeans keep the trading relationship with the Chinese, though. So it's never been the Chinese putting pressure on to cut relations with the United States. The Chinese, generally speaking, don't do that. In fact, I can remove the generally from that. They don't do that. They don't dictate who you can deal with and who you can't deal with. It's one of the reasons why their bargains in terms of trade are much more popular now than what the imperialists are offering. But they will say, the US that is, to the Europeans, you've got to do X, Y, and Z, or we're going to take action against you. And the Europeans are essentially so enthralled to the United States economically, but also culturally. And this is where you can bring in some analysis from the likes of Mao himself, which is that the cultural struggle ultimately derives from the material, but the cultural struggle is important because ultimately one of the reasons why these European regimes, even though they've got extensive interests within China, They've got an interest in maintaining relations with China. They are still subservient to the United States. Is partly because of, there's the economic question there, and flowing from that is a cultural domination. The culture of the countries is dominated by the US. The culture of the ruling class and the ruling institutions is dominated by the US, by the US bourgeoisie. And this is part of what the problem is. Yes, it flows from economic dominance, but even after the economic dominance has gone, even after it becomes really obvious that the US is on the fucking slide, and that the Chinese are a rising power in the world, and that not just China but like other countries in Southeast Asia are becoming more and more economically developed. Even then, for the Europeans, they can't get over this attachment to the United States because, yes, it's based on historic US economic domination, which is still strong but fading, but it's also based on decade after decade after decade of cultural domination, in the cultural sphere, in the political sphere, in the educational sphere. You have 3 generations, no more, 4 generations of leaders, political and intellectual and cultural, who have been completely brought up within an Americanized American imperialist system. They can't imagine a future that's different to that. Even when it's falling apart around them, they still can't imagine anything different. And that's part of the reason why things are as they are. Right. Okay. It is 2100 and we have 306 of you watching, 184 on X and 122 on YouTube. Not sure how many are watching on Rumble, but if you are, then good to have you with us. So I'm going to bring this to a close for tonight. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to the chat thus far. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. The audio version of this will be up on Patreon soon. Thank you to everybody who supports the program on Patreon and on Buy Me a Coffee link. That's all very much appreciated. It enables us to continue producing these programs. I'll be back again with you tomorrow with another program. But until then, thank you for joining me tonight. And I will now throw you back over to a brief musical interlude.